Merit, if you don't know, is a growing community whose members include scientists and scholars who collaborate to promote health professions, education, research, and apparently take selfies. Do that, please. We need more social. If you are interested in becoming a member, please visit merit.mcmaster.ca to learn more. You can also ask to be placed on our mailing list to hear about education events like these rounds or grant opportunities. For example, Merit and the Faculty of Health Sciences are promoting 2 small grants this month, one focused on mentorship and another on innovative education research. We're also more accessible online, as I mentioned. We have a Zoom link for people who prefer to learn about education in their pajamas. And moving forward, sorry, it wasn't an on-focus speaker, I'm sorry. I guess you could have worn whatever you want.
Now you tell her.
Going forward, you will be able to download archived recordings of rounds as well as informative interviews with our esteemed guests, presenters. So if you want to learn about Rachel's favorite color, I think there's an interview online that will be appearing soon. Today, our esteemed guest is likely the closest you'll come to meeting a dame. Not like Dame Edna or something like that, but it's because it's a dame only an analogy. Dr. Rachel Ellaway was once awarded the Queen's Anniversary Prize, the Queen of England, prize for her innovative work in learning technologies.
And Canada as well.
And Canada as well, sorry. Okay. That's it, yes. And the colonies. At the University of Edinburgh, right? They got that right. If that isn't enough, Dr. Ellaway was the recipient of 2 high honors this year alone. The Duncan Graham Award for Outstanding Contributions to Medical Education and the Ian Hart Award for Distinguished Contributions to Medical Education. So, driven by her innovations, outstandingness, and distinguished work, Dr. Ellaway is here to share her conclusion. All of medical education is simulation.
Thank you so much. So, when we were discussing what I was going to do at this session, we were at ICRE and we had this conversation. A few things out there. You said, "Oh no, this one sounds great." So it's entirely your fault. Hi, I'm Rachel Ellaway. I'm a professor at the University of Calgary, and I'm the director of our Office of Health and Medical Education Scholarship. And that has no bearing at all on what I'm going to say. We're supposed to do a declaration of a conflict of interest. I usually use this one because I think they're a bit silly, but also I'm hoping that you're going to get some sense of evil. If there's a slight sort of, if there's a sulfurous, if there's a mephitic air about this, then I'm doing my job quite right. And I really appreciate the opportunity in this case to actually go back to some work I did some time ago. And so I'm going to be reprising some of my ideas that I actually did way back, this is in 2011. So back in the day, I used to write a column for Medical Teacher called E-Medical Teacher, very, very imaginatively titled. And every month I had to come up with some completely random thought. And this is the one I came up, this is the 50th version of this column. And the idea is that all medical education is simulation. And in this paper, it's a short paper, I pointed to the fact, well, we have lots of ways that we simulate patients, whether they're mechanical, actors, lots of different things, but also increasingly we're thinking about simulating health professionals, teachers, and learners for lots of different reasons. I'm actually going to read one of my slides out a little bit later. I'm not going to read this one. The key thing is that my thesis then was that everything in medical education points towards providing care to patients. And there may be a number of steps until you get to that point, but there is always an implied patient presence. And therefore, we can think about the patient presence and what it takes to make a patient more or less present as a way of thinking about things that unite medical education as a whole. And if we can do this, then we can maybe start to unify our thinking around our approach to instructional design medical education. And I'm coming back to that topic after 8 years, and I'm going to give it another, well, I'm not sure it's a kick, but I'm certainly going to give it a shove. And the question is this still true? Was it true then? Is it true now? One of my concerns then was that this, as a conceptual area, was relatively unexplored. We actually don't look at this very deliberately. And if that is the case, and I will be, just as a disclosure, I will be arguing that it is still true, it is still unexplored. Therefore, what do we need to think about is the basic one I'm going to talk about. So let me talk about instructional design. Instructional design is only part of medical education. In some areas of higher education, it's a very major part of what people do, because instructional design is the act of designing for instruction. You can't really do much instructional design if you're precepting, because precepting is reactive. Precepting is, this is what the patient is, this is what we're doing. You can say, well, I'm going to draw attention to these people, or I'm going to push this patient at this learner, and so on. You can do some, but mostly instructional design is focused on the preparation, designing for learning rather than designing in the learning moment. And so anytime that you prepare materials, anytime that you are thinking about, I am going to put this thing together, I'm going to design a curriculum activity, I'm going to run a lecture, I'm going to do these kinds of things, then that's the idea of instructional design. And the key thing about that is that you do have to imagine. And I did this when I'm thinking about you as an audience. And this is what we do when we lecture. We imagine what the audience is going to be like, what they're going to say, what they're going to respond to, what they're not. And so we spend a lot of time kind of simulating what the lecture is going to be like in our heads as we go backwards and forwards, as we kind of put this slide here, we change the text here, they're going to laugh at this, they're not going to laugh at that, we're going to put this here, put this there. So there is this sense that instructional design, although not all medical educators engage in it, is nevertheless a critical part of the scope of engaging in medical education. And to do it takes time and effort. You know, the people who worry about credit for teaching use multipliers. So for every hour you teach, there is some assumption that maybe it's 3 or 4 hours or whatever it is, preparation time that goes into it. And that reflects this sense that often we spend a lot more time preparing to teach, at least in this kind of format, than we'll actually spend teaching. I mean, I'm going to talk for about 35, 40 minutes today, and then hand over for questions. And I definitely spent a lot more time than that putting these slides together, including taking silly pictures of myself. There are lots of different approaches for instructional design out there, and I'm not asking you to read these, I just want you to get a sense that there's lots of different approaches. This isn't even an exhaustive list. There are lots and lots of different approaches to instructional design, and I'm not going to be talking about any of them. The key thing is, though, that when we are engaging in design-based activities, when you are preparing lectures or seminars, when you're writing cases or guides for PBL, when you're coming up with simulation cases, all these aspects are central to medical education, and they all involve some kind of patient presence. And I will point, for instance, to Catherine Montgomery's rather wonderful book. In 2006, something very strange happened. 2 books came out, both called How Physicians Think. One was by a guy called Grootman, which was, in my opinion, not as good as the one that came out from Montgomery, nay Hunter, who was a much stronger scholar. And I really go back to Catherine's work again and again for some very, very key insights into some of the reified psychology of medical practitioners. And a central thesis for her book, just to kind of do a complete spoiler, is that case narrative is the primary mechanism through which physicians communicate with each other about the work that they do. And so I draw on this in thinking about how we go about designing the patient presence, because you can think about a spectrum, and you know the variations of doing this. You could even say this is a scaffolding spectrum, wherever. But you can go from highly abstract to very specific, very present representations of patients. So you can work with real patients. And there is a direct analog. The real patient, being a patient, is a direct representation of a patient. But you can also work with standardized patients, still human beings, still possibly individuals who do have certain conditions, like they may be young and they're not sure if being young is a medical condition, but it's something that eventually, given time, goes away. You can work with simulators, which are representations. You know, they're often pink plastic people. Why they're all pink, I don't know. And a lot of them look like Thor Laerdal as well. I'm not sure whether you use Laerdal or who are the folks in Ottawa, in Quebec, anyway, whatever they're called. Almost all of the Laerdal sims, at least the ones based on the male body, are actually based on the guy who started the company called Thor Laerdal. So if there's a sense that they all look rather sort of Scandinavian and very fit, then that's because this is the idea. Well, this is the guy's idea of at least what he used to look like. You can work with patient cases, say in problem-based learning or various other activities. In anatomy early on, you may work with cadavers, which will kind of were patients, but not in the state we generally want to work with them in. And even back to the point where you're engaging in some of the biomedical knowledge, I would still argue that there is a patient presence there. And so therefore we are constantly engaged in representations, or in place of the patient, and that's the idea that you're in place of the patient. And so you can actually think of this entire structure all the way down to implied patients. And you might mean, what do I mean by that? There are patients implied here. Not that you are going to be a manager, but you're a manager with and for patients. You're a communicator with and for patients. Patients are implied all the way through cameras, even though we may or may not actually explicitly say that. Even when we're teaching something like the Krebs cycle, what we mean is the Krebs cycle of a patient. This isn't just an abstraction to the point that it doesn't matter. We only teach this because all patients do this. If they don't, then I guess there's another problem going on. But even if they don't, that's still relevant because they should be doing this. And so my argument is, even though it can be extremely abstracted, there is always a patient presence in everything we do in medical education. And so if this is true, and I would continue to argue, and I hope you see at least the argument, even if you don't entirely agree, the implication is that we use this all the time, but we don't tend to think about this. This is not a form of thinking that we engage with in medical education. We don't consider the omnipresence of a patient, but in highly abstracted forms, as a unifying factor within medical education. Our culture is not to see this. Our culture is to deal with everything as if it were completely different areas. When you have a patient case, is not the same as a simulator, and it's definitely not the same as a lecture, or reading a textbook, or doing an OSCE, or something like that. We do this all the time. Whenever you engage with any representation of a patient, you are abstracting them. We pay attention to certain things and not to others. And so what does this actually mean? What do we actually mean by this? Well, we do patient abstractions all the time. That's a fairly basic abstraction of patient. I mean, that's 5 lines and a circle, but most people will read that as a human being. There is an agreed abstract format that we recognize as stick figure. I mean, there's that sort of classic thing that here's mommy and daddy in front of a house, and mommy and daddy are just different size stick figures, and the house usually is kind of like square with maybe with a roof and a little curl of smoke. It's like kids draw trains as if they're steam trains when they've never seen a steam train in their entire lives. Totally bizarre, except maybe Thomas. But we do this in many other places as well. You know, we use it for signage. We use it when we need to get a very simple idea across about a person to communicate. And you know, these are the icons from the '76 Olympic Games. And the idea is that you could, no matter what language you spoke, you could quickly look at this and get a sense of what's going on. This is a really good way to learn where I need to go when you're trying to negotiate a complex environment where many different things are happening. A patient human abstraction, abstracting people, is something that's all the way through art. So that's Bacon across the top, Picasso, De Chirico, and Arcimboldo. And we do this and we make a whole aesthetic experience of it. I mean, I don't think any of us remember Picasso first doing this, but the jokes about Picasso faces are still knocking about. This idea that the abstraction is somewhat weird, but we can still entirely recognize all of these things as faces, whereas if we actually saw any of these things for real, then either we'd be driving someone to the emergency room straight away, or we'd be wondering whether there was something in the water we just drank. Abstracting people can also have political consequences. So when we take people and we make abstractions of them, they can also create social, political, challenging spaces through the nature of the abstractions we engage in. So whether or not we clearly perceive it, we are doing this all the time. We are always creating and using patient representations. And like any simulation, there's an intrinsic tension between the real and the abstraction that goes with it. And you can say, well, how does that work? Well, maybe we look at paper patients. We can compare, for instance, paper representations for education with paper representations for practice. But those are still representations. We can say the same thing when we move from paper to a digital environment. We can compare representations that are being put together, for instance, for educational purposes, with representations for clinical purposes. And yet there is still a sense of abstraction in both of those. There is it's surprising how quickly it's become a bit of a meme, but the idea of a physician with an electronic health record who's spending more time paying attention to the electronic health record patient than they are to the physical one sitting right next to them, because they're tip-tap typing away. In the end, you might even argue the physicians treat the virtual patient, the in silico patient, as much, if not more, than their physical analog that's going to be sitting right in front of them. And even when we have live human beings, maybe sometimes they are intentionally abstractions through design of creating bits of people. I mean, if you were to go into a room and you were seeing bits of chopped off legs and, you know, arms and shoulders and things, you think either you come into some dreadful nightmare, this idea that there are bits of, there's a charnel house, or that you're in a simulation laboratory because there are lots of plastic bits of bodies and things and tubes and guts hanging out all over the place. And that seems entirely right. But even when we interact with real humans, there is a sense that there we are still simulating something. There is still something that's not entirely real because of the relationship that we're putting that representation to in front of the learner. So in all of these cases, in every situation where we think about patient abstractions, I think we need to think very carefully about what aspects of the patient are presented and which ones are absent, which ones have been taken away or hidden or minimized or turned into some other format. How have those aspects of the patient been abstracted? How have they been transmuted? How have they been edited to the point where they now are supporting the intent of the activity or that representation? How are people encountering representations of patients supposed to respond to those representations? If you see a virtual patient, for instance, as you're working with somebody on screen, how are you supposed to respond to them? There's the ongoing debate about whether simulated cases are allowed to die. Because the sense that if they die, then the students are going to be traumatized and they're going to never go and see a patient for real. And the other counter argument is, well, they're going to die. Some of them are going to die. Well, they're all going to die eventually, but hopefully not directly as part of your care. But there's this sense that somehow you still need to allow them to die because that's part of the care process. That does happen in some cases. But we don't really have a good sense about what the learner is supposed to take from a patient where we've taken these things out and only left certain things behind. So there are real issues that we need to think within medical education, the science of medical education, about the way that we're using these patient abstractions. And yet we know quite a lot about learning activities, this sense, well, we're going to design an OSCE or we're going to build an activity or something. We do a lot of research here, but we do very little research here, which is about the design, the way that we undergo making these representations, these abstractions. We tend to do very little research here, which is how learners would respond to the kind of abstractions that they're encountering, which take us on to the concept of design for learning. It's like instructional design, but this is more, instructional design is designed to instruct. Design for learning is designing so that learning can happen. And if we were all living in a wonderfully benign world, then those two things would be synonymous, but they're not. Often what people do to instruct does not necessarily lead to learning, and there's plenty of evidence to back that up. So what do? Well, we tend to simplify. We take something that's complicated and make it more simple. We tend to select certain things, we focus on certain things, we draw attention to certain things, we put other things to the background, we sort things so that some things become more apparent and some less so. We abstract, we take something complicated and make it simpler, and we edit, we take things in and out all the time. Do we know whether what we omit, remove, or de-emphasize is actually the right thing? Do we actually have a good scientific basis for doing so? Do we know if what we keep and add and emphasize is really helping and ending the outcomes we really want to get to? And what we change, what we remediate in the sense of we just change the medium through which it's represented. We take a real patient and move them into a software application and so on. Do any of those things really make a big difference? Well, given that they are central to the design repertoire, we think we'd have really good answers for this. And while we have really good evidence on certain aspects, we don't on others. But there is some literature that talks to that. And there's this paper by Norman or somebody or other, who talked and compared the difference between engineering fidelity and psychological fidelity. And the critical thing is not that everything looks exactly the same as it would in real life. And I'm thinking particularly of the work of people like Roger Kneebone, who spent a lot of time getting the sounds and smells of operating theaters absolutely precise. But Jeff and his group back in 2012 pointed out that it's not so much that it's the absolute representation, but the representation of the psychological qualities that you need to do about learning the skill, engaging the task. I might call it task fidelity, but essentially it's what do you need to do these things. And this, for instance, is a really good example for why the high fidelity, low fidelity argument, in the sense, well, I can either buy a 10,000 simulator or go to the dollar store and do it for $2, a bit of Evo stick and a rubber band, and you'll actually get the same level of outcomes from it, is a critical factor, because if you're representing the task, what you need to go through and do the activity, then that's appropriate without necessarily worrying about all the other things that a lot of people do seem to get into. Likewise, there is some research into problem-based learning case design. Some of it's come out of this place. This is a template, for instance, that's on MedEd portal that just says, well, there's lots of different, you need to have cues and characters and images and problems and so on. I don't actually buy this, but I think it's an interesting fact that there's a structure, there's an argument at least that there are some science to back this up. And so there is some work that points to this. It's not that this is an entirely neglected area, but the area is not coherent around what are the common underlying characteristics. And so if we don't have a coherent approach to how we go about abstraction, we only have these kind of little coincident pieces of research, we really don't know how we should go about doing this, how we should go about doing this to affect different kinds of learning outcomes or build different kinds of learning experiences. And so really, I think one of the key gaps is, and what I really want to focus on today is, how do we think about heuristics, rules of thumb, if nothing else? Ideally, good, strong evidence-based practice would be better, but if we, in the absence of that, this kind of works in this situation may be as good as we have, but not sure we even have that. How do we get to that point? Now, of course, I'm going to draw on the work of a very great Argentinian in doing so. So let me introduce Jorge Luis Borges. This is Borges. Rather like Foucault, he was always making faces. And Borges wrote a lot of very interesting work, but this is one short story, and I'm going to read this to you. This is the entire story. In that empire, the art of cartography attained such perfection that the map of a single province occupied the entirety of a city, and the map of the empire the entirety of a province. In time, those unconscionable maps no longer satisfied, and the Cartographers' Guild struck a map of the empire whose size was that of the empire, and which coincided point to point with it. The following generations, who were not so fond of the study of cartography as their forebears, saw that that vast map was useless, and not without some pitilessness was it that they delivered it up to the inclemencies of sun and winters. In the deserts of the West, still today, there are tattered ruins of that map, inhabited by animals and beggars. In all the land, there is no other relic of the disciplines of geography. I love this story. That's the entire story. And he even made up a completely random fictitious quote. This is part of the story, the quote. So he turned the citation into art. I love this because it's that point that if you want greater and greater precision, in the end, your representation is as complicated, if not more complicated, than the thing you're trying to use to represent it. And this is, and clearly that's a reductio ad absurdum, but that is what we imply. As a corollary of this, clearly for all the people who watch Blackadder, this is General Melchett inspecting a map of the territory gained during a major push on the front in 1917, and he asked the question, what's the actual scale of this map, darling? And it turns it's 1 to 1. So they figured out, they actually managed to gain, for the cost of about 1,000 lives, about 6 square feet of land. So same principle, scale matters. If you look at this place, you look at MAC, there are lots of these map representations. You might say, well, sometimes I want to use this representation because it shows me all the sort of landscape and where the trees are. But you might just want to use a much more simplified version, or indeed you might want to use any of the different representations. And I was quite delighted to see that there are lots and lots of different representations of how to get around MAC. And bless it, I actually had guides, so I didn't need to use any of them, so thank you all. But the key thing is we can learn, for instance, from cartography. And what does cartography do? It has a series of practices, a series of heuristics, a series of ways of thinking about turning reality into a map. You start off by having to select a scale. What scale are you going to work? And so if you map this back to patients, you say, we're going to do it at the scale of cells, or individual people, or whole populations, or any variation in between. Are you thinking about a time scale in the sense of, are we just going to do it right now, or are we going to say over a period of time? We select a focus. We are going to focus on this to the exclusion of other things. So it may be about what clinical topic do you want to go, or what presentation. You also may want to think about whether this is maybe for assessment or for teaching, or if you believe both of them are the same, as I do, then you want to think about where are you trying to get to from the educational point of view. You have to select what you're going to leave in or omit. Again, if you start building your one-to-one map so that you can get something to your house, you're going to take the rest of your life building it, and it's still no use. So you have to select what you're going to leave out, and the omission is perhaps more important than the inclusion. It's certainly as important about what you do put in and do not. You simplify features so you can emphasize them. You symbolize other features. I'm not sure how many of you have ever used a SimMan 3G. So these are the sort of big pink plastic robots you can get. So one of their selling points is that they cyanosis. But what the cyanosis actually looks like is the little blue LED that comes on in the mouth. So it looks more like they've got very acute radiation poisoning. Although this is basically Cherenkov radiation going off right there. Not good. I mean, essentially they are already dead if that's the case. We exaggerate features for emphasis. We mask or displace others. And we render in many different media for our convenience, but also for allowing us to present different aspects of what's going on. So we can maybe repurpose this into a series of design principles or heuristics for thinking about how do we go about, as a common set of practices, abstract our patients, select a scale, select a focus, decide what we're going to include and omit, figure out what we're going to emphasize, symbolize, exaggerate, mask, and then think about whether we're going to change the medium. Let me come back to simulation. There are lots of definitions of simulation. In fact, one of the things about the simulation literature is everybody then, as soon as the first opening paragraph of the paper is they redefine simulation. And so, you know, I'm not sure it's one thing. It's more a discourse of who's going to define it in a very slightly different way today. David Gabbers talked about this idea that there are activities that evoke, replicate substantial aspects of the real world. Bill McGahey talked more about the simulator rather than simulation, focusing on the devices they use and then what people do with these devices. But if you look at what happens in simulation, and I'm sure you have a simulation lab like everybody does, it's full of pink plastic people. And there is this normative sense that involves people gathering around a pink plastic person and, okay, then somebody says, go, and then you have to do things, and then you stop, and everybody goes, like the Olympics, 9, 10, 8, 7, 6. There is so much more to simulation than this. One coincident theory is Schoen's idea of the practicum. The sense that there are things that you can't necessarily teach in the sense that it's declarative knowledge that you just transfer from one person to another, if that ever happens at all. But this idea that you need to put people in increasingly authentic situations, it's pretty much Vygotsky, it's Brunner as well with scaffolding, the idea that you move people towards practice by simulating and gradually you take off the training wheels until they're flying in real world practice. It's the whole thesis of CBME after all. And the idea is these are authentic, they're safe, the inclusion, exclusion of factors sound familiar. Careful abstraction and representation is a critical part of building the practicum. What do you include? What do you not? What do you make real? What do you make less real? Learning theory can be applied to simulation, but there's no one learning theory that is directly, that covers all of simulation. And like anything where if you can find 10 or more learning theories that apply, then learning theory and simulation are not the same thing. They are intersecting, they are orthogonal. Not to say that these are not useful theories in terms of thinking about simulation, but simulation is not a theory. What do we know what works? I go back to Barry Eisenberg's paper. This is definitely the most popular BME review, not that that's necessarily an indicator of anything. And this is from 2005, and this was probably one of the most cited papers in the simulation literature that said the critical factors that what works in simulation is that you provide feedback. You engage in repetitive practice. You integrate simulation in the curriculum. I'll let you read the rest of them. But the key thing is that you have a critical number of factors that you need for simulation to work. And this kind of looks like, to me, like not just an instructional framework for simulation, but for medical education as a whole. Because where would you not provide feedback, use repetitive practice, engage in appropriate instruction, provide individualized learning? And so essentially, this model for simulation is in very ways a good set of practices for medical education. Are they not just good practices in general? But also think about what we're really looking at here. And I'm going to compare this to the work of Elaine Van Mel and others who've been defining and redefining competency-based medical education. And the current, at the moment, because it does keep changing, but as of today, I believe this is right, is that there are these 5 different characteristics. You need to have an outcomes competency framework, progressive sequencing, experiences tailored to competencies, teaching tailored to competencies, and programmatic assessment. And so it's a compound of things. It's not one strategy. And one of the strengths and benefits potentially of competency-based medical education is not that it's a new thing, but it's a compound of things we've known for many, many years, that actually good teaching is better than bad teaching. And some assessment that's integrated with teaching is a good thing. And as such, then you can say, well, then it's what I would call a pattern language. Pattern languages are a way of talking about a series of characteristics, most of which, but not necessarily all of which, need to be present for something to be valid. David Alexander was an architectural theoretician. There are such things. He was one of them. And he developed this idea of saying, well, what is it that's common about buildings? Well, they have doors, and they have windows, and they have roofs and walls. There are common things. They're rendered in very different ways. This room looks different from the other rooms you've been in, but you recognize the pattern language of building because you spent so much of your life in it. And this is the same idea, that when you have these compound structures, they are pattern languages, because you don't need all of them to still recognize the pattern. You can recognize a door even if you can't see the handle on it. You can recognize a window even if it's got a curtain over it, and so on and so on and so on. And so my argument is not just that simulation gives us a set of design heuristics and characteristics that we can think about in preparing all medical education, but it is also a pattern language. It also has all these characteristics. This is a pattern language. These things don't all have to be present, but the more that they are, theoretically, and I'm kind of rather over-interpreting Barry's work at this point, but the idea is all of these things can help you move to be good simulation, I think, good medical education. And a pattern language, therefore, is rather than saying, well, is it here or is it not? It's just saying, well, which bits are here? How do we put these things together? What are the sub-patterns we consider? And it allows us to think, I think, in terms of a much more flexible approach to instruction for all medical education, using simulation as a starting point, but a pattern language frame which allows you to be much more combinatory about structuring things in a more fluid manner, as a way of approaching this unified approach to medical education instructional approaches. And so I'd say, well, simulation is not a single practice, it's many, but it can be used as a pattern language, central of which is patient abstraction as approach to health professions education as well. Now, one of the key things about patterns is not all those elements need to be there. And so we need to think about, if this is true, and I know I'm floating a rather big, hairy hypothesis at this point, but if this is true, then we need to think about what needs to be there and what happens when certain elements are or are not present. We can think of a more fluid approach to this instruction approach, but in a way that it has an underlying common structure. We also need to pay more attention as how do learners engage with patient abstractions. I mean, we put a mannequin in front of them, we put a virtual front patient, we give them a PBL case, but we often don't tend to think about what is it that is abstracted about the patient and that actually the individuals are expected to engage with. You know, we worry, for instance, about the dehumanization of medicine. We don't just say a cholecystectomy walked in the room. We say a patient with a cholecystectomy or may need a cholecystectomy walked into the room, and so on. And so are these aspects that we need to think about also part of this approach to instructional design? Whoop, what happened there? There we go. So we need to figure out how our students learn from different abstractions. What do they learn? Are there certain characteristics we need to include or not? Not sure how many of you saw the movie Patch Adams. It's a lovely point where there's a diabetic patient lady on the table, and all the medical students cluster around with their clipboards, and they're all talking to the doctor, and the patient's lying there looking more and more scared, and they're all asking very technical questions, and in the very typical Hollywood heroic way, Patch Adams, i.e. Robin Williams, says, any other questions? And he says, yes, what's your name? And so engages with the patient in a different way. And so this idea that we can get in and out of what is it we need to include and what do we not, and what are the psychological, what are the moral implications of thinking about what we do and do not include in these patient abstractions as cues, as part of the learning experience. If we don't get these things right, there is much to indicate that we do have problems. If the wrong cues are given to learners, if they're drawn to pay attention to, say, the overly technical or technocratic approach to medicine at the cost of the humanist approach to medicine, then we definitely have a problem. And so we do need to be thinking about what is it we abstract, what do we leave in, what do we change, what do we make into different formats as part of these things. Otherwise, we have quite a large risk that we're going to start giving our learners quite the inappropriate messages. Do we even have any sense about how learners are not just what cues and learning do they take from those patient abstractions, but to what extent are they building an understanding of their practice and their understanding how they engage with patients, with human beings, because of the way that we abstract things? I think there are some considerate issues that we need to get to, which do have moral and ethical as well as practical considerations. Now, how might we do that? Some of the things I've been talking about, do we think about this more as a pattern language? Do we think about the difference between simulation and dissimulation? That's Baudrillard's concept of simulation is clearly flagging that it's not real. Dissimulation tries to pretend this is actually real. At what point does that forge different kind of educational affordances? And I will give an example. One of the things that I understand New York State does is from time to time they send patient ringers into their family physician's offices to audit how well that family physician is doing. And so it's like this is an individual presenting as a simulated patient, but the idea is that the physician does not know that that's the case. And the idea is if they react normally to somebody who's okay, then they're probably okay. And if they react badly, then we have a problem with that physician. And so we have to think about, for instance, what do we actually make clear is not real and what do we actually pretend is real? Fourth wall techniques that we actually draw attention to the unreality. We engage with the student as in, you should be thinking about this is not a real patient, and what does that mean? Lots of different dimensions. We may also think more about the idea of a curriculum of abstraction, that we intrinsically engage in a language of abstraction, we frame things through abstraction, and there may be ways that we need to be more careful or more deliberate or maybe more abstract in terms of thinking about the way we engage learners with abstractions. And I point, for instance, just to one, the idea of developing schemas. A schema is a simple representation of a more complex structure. It's one of the key ways that we engage learners early on. Well, you need to understand this in a broad sense. If you ever been, I'm assuming that you taught some atomic physics in high school. And to start off with, what they would have done is said, well, there's an atom. Then they would say, well, yes, there's an atom which has a thing in the middle and then a big thing that goes around the outside. And they say, well, that's not right, because there's certain kinds of things and certain other kinds of things. Okay, that's fine. But actually, there's lots of these things that go around the outside. But that's not right, because some of them do this, and then some of them do that, and so on and so on and so on. And each one is a schema keyed to a certain developmental stage. So the development of schema, this idea that we create simple abstractions and then we kind of replace them and move them gradually towards practice is critical. They are all abstractions in the way we think about things. So what in conclusions will I take from this? I think this is an interesting starting point. I don't know, I haven't tested this. This was Rachel come up with some really kind of mad idea, so you're welcome. But an idea that I think has legs that is worth exploring, the idea that we can think of a common instructional approach across many aspects, if not all aspects of medical education, that derives on simulation as our common or coordinating approach. Central to which is the idea of how do we deal with patient abstractions? How do we create them? How do we present them? How do learners, what do they take from them? Are there problems as well as advantages in how they engage with those things? So if simulation is or could be a pattern language of instruction, if it is a repertoire of techniques we consider, then we might have an approach that actually unifies all aspects of medical education. Because at the moment, we have lots of bits. We have the psychometry people over here. We have the sim people over here. Some people are worried about humanities and psychosocial. Some people are worried about lecturing. There are lots of little pockets of people working on things. And it's very, very granular, very, very siloed. This might be. And I'll finish in about 2 minutes, and so you can then have at me on this basis. But it might be an approach to think about the common factors, the pattern languages, or the pattern language we use to engage with all aspects of medical education. We might go even further. We might think about more about this idea of the trajectory towards practice. We are always engaging with learners who are trying to get to the practice environment. So, for instance, we might think about, well, why don't we use more virtual reality? One of the key things I have a problem with virtual reality in medical education is its virtuality, because the whole point is it's going further away from reality. If you think about the scaffolding kind of double ramp, you ramp down with the amount of supporting, you ramp up the complexity and approach to practice. Then one of the key things you need to do is always have that direction. There's always this push that you're always trying to head towards practice. And so you should only prepare activities that directly and logically move learners towards practice. You shouldn't engage in anything that's moving them further away from practice. And you think about the things that learners hate the most. I would say mostly it's because they can't see, how does this apply to being a doctor? Most learners from day one to go on to come in to then go, give me 20 milligrams epinephrine stat. And then, you don't understand me. My parents hated me. And they go into these sort of huge dramatic. They want to do that. They want to have that access to the real. They want to be in those spaces as soon as possible. Anything that takes away from that is problematic. And therefore, again, it comes back to this idea that the core construct of the patient and the trajectories towards the patient are a critical common organizing factor in what we do. So I think we should ask questions in anything we see. Where is the patient? How are they represented? How do these representations move learners? Do they move them, and how do they do it? How might they hinder that journey? How might we make them more effective? And can we consider this being connecting all medical education rather than these little silos of activity? Now, grand unified theorems are usually extremely dodgy things because they never work, and they're often to end up some kind of weird religious space rather than something that's actually in science. However, I would argue that simulation can at least provisionally be used as a common instructional model across all medical education. And if that's the case, then we might be able to consider what the common factors are and common practices that we might approach in approaching instructional design in medical education. What all this means for you, I will now open for discussion.
So two things. I'll speak louder than I usually do. So two things. In PBL, I just finished a PBL workshop. In PBL, you spend a lot of time working around on the internet trying to figure out how much you actually need to know and what the right things for you to learn are. And in my experience, one of the ways to navigate what do I actually need to know, is this a resource for me or is this for a patient, is whether or not you talk about you or one or a patient, and that patients have bodies and that doctors have patients, and that's sort of the divide that I kind of bumped into. I was wondering how you might think about that in this sort of all medical education and simulation piece, maybe also in conversation with the fact that a lot of medical education really does ask students to engage with their own experiences and their own experiences of bodies and their bodies specifically.
So having just recently co-authored a paper on embodiment, I didn't actually think to weave that in, so thank you for picking up on that absence. Embodiment is a critical factor we often pay very little attention to. Our own bodies, the sense of embodiment of others, and although it's tacitly a major part, when you hear how physicians describe certain sounds, lung sounds, heart sounds, carotid coughs, whatever, there's a lot of this in there. It's like rushing, it's like crackling, it's like whatever. There is a lot in there, and one of the implications then, which I'm kind of extrapolating on the fly from that, is the sense, well, everybody's a patient, in the sense everybody has a body, until we have truly virtual students. I'm not quite sure they won't look like. But that's a really good point. Then not only is all medical education simulation, but all medical education implies the embodiment of yourself and everybody else you're going to interact with. And simulation has the sense of, well, how abstract or how specific am I going to talk about that? Might be a way to look at how do we structure that into a curriculum. If we went straight to the full embodied experience and all its wonders and strangenesses, again, we would be somewhat overwhelmed. So we start off with simple structures and work to increasingly complex structures. And I'm not sure we really think about what that means from an embodiment point of view. We may or may not do it tacitly or implicitly, but looking at that in a more deliberate way would be a really interesting approach. Think about, how do we change medical education practice? What is the same? But also, what is it we're doing when we're not doing it, as well as what happens when we do it and how might we do it well or more effectively?
You and I talked earlier about the devil's advocate, and so although I really, really like the talk, and I think the idea of simulation and the idea of critical elements really is a framework that goes beyond the kind of way we were talking about it in 2012. Nevertheless, there's a little bit of me that gets a bit anxious, and it goes around the word all. It seems to me that, well, I'll give you two examples. One is in the first medical curriculum, one of the problems, courtesy of Jim Anderson, who I talked about to somebody else, is why doesn't a penguin's feet freeze? Now, of course, it turns out that, I'm told, not that I understand, but that the arteries and the veins in a penguin's foot run side by side, and that's why the venous return blood is warmed up by the arterial blood. And somehow that's a model of something, countercurrents in the kidney. How am I doing, Teresa?
I never planted penguin feet on that.
Oh, you should.
Nephrology, I was saying.
The problem is that I could also argue that all of all the simulation actually is physics, because after all, physics is about atoms, and atoms make molecules, and molecules make complex molecules, and complex molecules make biology, and biology make people.
It's the Sheldon.
So it's a bit slippery, and penguin's feet is one example. Epidemiology, public health kind of issues, yeah, at some level you could say, of course it's about patients, but at another level it's a very different epistemology, if you like. And so, although I really like the global framework you presented, I think there's a certain risk in claiming that it covers everything.
And that reflects my intention to be provocative. Is the sense that I haven't tested this. I don't believe that it actually does cover all aspects, because I'm naturally a skeptic. I think it's likely that it may cover quite a few, but I haven't tested this any more than anybody else. This is a hypothesis turned into a presentation. So I may well be wrong. But I'd like to if it could serve us all, then where is the point where it stops being like that? Because you might say, well, it stops being when you move into biochemistry. In which case, the probe cycle doesn't belong to a patient, but the implication it is. And so, is there a point where it's well, the penguin's feet? But you're asking because you want to know about blood flow, because you actually want to understand patients. And so, there's still at some fairly tenuous level an abstraction. There's a relationship back to a patient, and I think that is probably arguable. Whether or not the tenuous nature of that relationship becomes so tenuous that it no longer actually provides value, I don't know. But that's a crackingly interesting question to explore. And I think having a common framework that you might just orient and actually start joining the research, like you've done and other people have done, to have a line of conversation and ask the question: how much of medical education truly is about medical education, or is it just education in general? In the sense, it's not pointing towards the patient at all. And I don't know the answer to that either. But I think it's a really good question to ask, and this, I would hope, is a useful lens to at least to start to explore.
So I'm going to pick up on Jeff's question and your response here. I was trying to figure out what my question was, and I didn't have it. So this is an easier way for me to go. I'm just sort of interested in, it's kind of, well, where does it end, and where does medicine begin, I suppose, right? And I'm just intrigued by this idea that you've moved further away on the abstraction, and so if we move into Krebs cycle, maybe that's where it ends. The way I was thinking about it is around this idea of the suspension of disbelief, and how important that is for simulation and the education or the learning that comes out of it. And so I was thinking more along the lines that it ends, and the other thing begins when you stop suspending disbelief and actually believing that what you're doing is for the patient in this moment. So it was more learner-centered in the
And again, that's a
trajectory.
hypothesis.
So I'll put that over to you.
It's a hypothesis worth exploring. But think about I don't know how you do things here, but I know that you used to be all PBL, and then you went to sort of mixed PBL lectures. No? Whatever it is you're
It's
doing.
always been PBL with lectures
Okay.
since day one.
So there are lectures, and you probably, like almost every other medical school in the world, have people who are super special in their area say, I want to lecture on my thing. And then they lecture to first-year undergrad medical students at the PhD level in their subject. Because they're so super passionate about it, they really want people to know, I don't know, neonatology or genetics of this, or they love their thing so much. And the feedback you get from students is well, apart from the scratching, I have no idea what you just said, but also, how does this apply to practice? And so students themselves are asking right from the get-go, and in fact, the more abstract it is, the more likely they are to ask the question, how does this apply? How is this making me a good doctor? I want to go and be a surgeon, I want to go and be a whatever. I can't see how this extremely abstruse, probably brilliant, but who can tell, it's just completely opaque to me. How does this apply to me being a doctor? And that's essentially a similar kind of construct. They're trying to see that connection. Not in the sense, do I believe that this is a patient, or that they can see that it's a patient, but how does this connect me to practice? And practice means patients. Maybe public health, but that's lots of things. And so there is an implication, I think, that it connects to practice. Maybe it's the abstraction to practice rather than the abstraction to patient, except patient means practice. Non-physician in the room, but that's my understanding. But I think these kind of philosophical arguments, as in, where are these points? Is there a crossover? Is there a pure continuity, but it has become so tenuous it doesn't matter anymore? Or are the construct really important? And it's from the learner's point of view, How does this get me into the operating theatre, into the wards, seeing patients is a critical construct. They come in from day one and they really want to see that connection. And if we were to say the Krebs cycle of the patient or the neonatology of the patient or whatever, and we're making that connection more direct, it may make it more real to them, as well as allow us to think in a more structured way about how do we then create the instructional episodes around that and stop all the super PhDs coming lecturing about their extremely interesting to them but not to anybody else kind of sessions. I've just alienated everybody in the world.
I would say that what you've spoken about to me really resonates, because as someone who went through the system asking those questions and then helping to redesign curricula and now doing more faculty development on this, it's to me the substrate of it, not that it's well, I guess in a way it is simulation, even in practice. Because I'm there as an emergency physician on an evening shift, if my learner's there, it's kind of a simulation. Because I go let them see the patient, but I kind of saw the patient already. And I kind of go let them run around the park, but I'm kind of tidying up behind and making sure that this, things are smoothed out.
Maybe
The charge
directing
is
them
not
away from
yelling.
more acute situations.
Or direct them to the acute, and I'll go see the stubbed toe that's going to yell at me because they've been waiting for 6 hours, right? And so there is still that instructional design still resonates with me, and that framing of the fact that the training probably doesn't actually, unless I really sit there, really sit there. And there are times when I have done that, brought my laptop, because I have a 5th-year resident about to enter practice. They're in the last 3 months, and they said, "Tian, bring your papers, you can write them while I work." And I said, okay. And I am there as a trapeze net and a safety valve, but really, other than watching them and maybe giving them some feedback, that is the only time they are fully doing practice on their own. And I'm gifted with that specialty that I can do that, because a lot of other specialties functionally, it's not a find and replace with the learner replacing me, they are in addition to me, and that changes the game. So I think it's interesting to layer that into the different contexts to use as a frame. So I think it's useful as a way to frame it. How much of your clinical experience is but a simulation, right? I remember the practicum that I did for a teacher's college, same thing. At some point, my supervisor teacher was literally in the back room, I think playing video games at some point he was, and I was teaching the class, right? And was that simulation or was that practice? And I think that that's something to have a conversation about, because I think that when that simulation is no longer a simulation, then someone is practicing, and I think that would be a very interesting transitional point that would be worth exploring.
I mean, simulation, there's some degree of things that are being removed. All the risk, all the exposure is being removed. So you're kind of like puppeting the environment, adding or closing and directing and so on. So I'd say there's part of that. But also frame it in a different way. This is not related to what I talked today, but I'm writing a book in my sabbatical coming up about augmentation. One of the key things about augmentation is not necessarily what you add, but what you take away. And so the things you take out of the environment is okay. It's like the Apollo 13. You need to build one of these out of this. It says you have to build a carbon monoxide scrub out of only the things that are in the lunar module, because that's the only thing they have available to them out in space. And so it's that situation where you limit people's choices, you limit their ability to respond. So you focus them on the certain learning or access, and you're essentially, what you're talking about is you're puppeting, you're not arranging, you're directing the environment. You're like a stage manager saying, well, you go over here and you talk to these people, but you've got this back of the mind thinking you're assessing risk, you're assessing opportunity, you're assessing capacity, you're assessing your own ability to be able to do the safety net stuff if you do. That's all some of those critical skills that come into simulation about how do you control the environment around which patients are being exposed.
Hi Rachel, it's Lara Barpio. So I want to start by thanking you so very much for a thoughtful and thought-provoking talk. I have to say I've been sitting here thinking about your premise that a unifying theory could benefit the field, such as a proposal that simulation connects everything we do in MedEd. And Rachel, if I'm completely candid, the idea that there could be a unifying theory to our field is mildly terrifying.
Good.
And I mean that in the very best way, because if I'm uncomfortable, it means you're challenging my premises. So I really do want to thank you for that. So if I understand correctly, the premise, or one of the underlying premises you have is that we are constantly engaging in an abstraction of the patient. And with the goal being that we eventually deal with the real patient so that the abstraction becomes less and less, or we get closer and closer to reality. But my question is this, if we give credence to theories like actor network theory, the idea then is that we can't engage with the full reality of our lives in our daily lives. We need to deal with abstractions or punctualizations, if we use actor network terms, in order to function. So for instance, I deal with the abstract reality that my car is a thing and it works. I don't think about what's going on with the bits and the bobs underneath the hood. I only deal with that full reality if the car breaks down. So perhaps if I were to tack on to your hypothesis, this thesis you're proposing, perhaps the goal of our medical education practices is to know when to contend with the abstractions that hide the full reality of the patient, and then to know when to unpack or fully realize the patient when we need to. So when something with the patient isn't working in the way that enables me to hide it, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I mean, but I would then argue, I mean, I actually agree with everything you're saying, but to be a patient is an abstraction of what it is to be a human being. A patient is a role, something we play the role of a patient. You can only be a patient in the context of healthcare being provided to you. In other places, you're a mother, you're a daughter, you are a hockey player, whatever you are, you play many different roles. So patient is an abstraction. The healthcare system intrinsically abstracts you. If you go into a walk-in clinic, you can present one condition, you can't present anything else. There are only a certain number of options available to you. If you're using an electronic health record, there are only certain structures you can do. To make healthcare efficient, we intrinsically apply an abstraction layer so that we deal with certain things and not other things. I mean, it's one of the, it's that sort of heart-sinking moment that a family doctor gets a patient who wants to start showing their holiday snaps and talk about the little dog and this happened and so on. It's that sort of monologuing effect that you just don't want to get into, because you actually want to push them into being the abstract patient role, that they're going to do the things which you want to do. Is give me the information, I'll come up with a diagnosis or a treatment plan or something, and I'm going to do that back. So all human interaction, particularly in the healthcare system, but possibly in other places, is also abstract, because at what point are we ever entirely in all ourselves present? I mean, we're present in the sense that we walk into the room and they're in us, but we are performing ourselves all the time. And the performance that individuals have as patients, as well as the performance that the individuals have as healthcare providers, is in itself a form of abstraction. I hadn't thought about that. So thank you, Laura. I think that's an important point, and maybe, if anything, strengthens the theory. Maybe.
Can I just build on that, because it's directly related to that, and Laura's put it much more intellectually than I was going to in his sense. But I mean, really, if we think about levels of abstraction, when we engage with a patient, when we engage in anything, we're engaging in a level of representation from what's mediated through our senses and through our nervous system to create a representation of reality in our brain. So I mean, really, in that sense, our entire lives are a simulation or a representation, right? Like
an abstraction.
An abstraction. So.
So this is the Matrix.
I'm saying,
I was going to say, welcome to the Matrix.
Can I have, like how, like.
Stacy took the words out of my mouth.
Oh,
All life is an abstraction, and an abstraction and simulation are interchangeable. And at that point, it's lost all meaning.
I agree.
After all, your working memory consists of 7 plus or minus 2 chunks. That says that we can only deal with a certain limited number of variables, a certain amount of information at any time. To survive in the world, we must abstract. And we selectively abstract based on the task we're trying to achieve at that moment.
But that's the critical. So abstraction is everywhere, and I agree. If we're interested in the abstraction itself, it's the problem. But it's the deliberate use of abstraction to achieve approach. So it's not abstraction per se. It's the act of abstracting to an end, which I think is more the critical point within the educational space.
And if we understand that everything at some level, everything in our experience is that extraction and abstraction from a reality, that influences the way we think about instructional design and design learning. Right?
And there are lots of, and plus we're in a culture that, all cultures do this, so we are enculturated to that as a normal part of life, to the point which is one reason I don't think we notice it as much, or at least we don't pay much attention, because it is so intrinsically everywhere.
I mean,
so
it's
we
an
just do it.
epistemological stance, right? It's the difference between an epistemological stance that says, we are accessing some reality, and an epistemological stance that recognizes how mediated that is.
So I'm kind of rethinking my argument on the fly, because I get to do that. Is maybe the key point here is that deliberate side of it, but it's also about being more attentive to it. And acknowledging that it is a deliberate part of a lot of what we do in medical education, and as such is deserving of more attention in and of itself, as opposed to just being an accepted part of practice that we generally don't tend to pay as much to as a thing in and of itself.
And I think that it's, the real critical thing is when we use the abstraction, the difference between when we use the abstraction to suspend our disbelief about our learning for patients to using the abstraction to believe that we're doing something.
Yes, that's the simulation.
That's the critical transition for the learning.
And that means that's a great theoretical starting point. I mean, there's a study right there.
It also seems to me that this is a useful counterpoint to these silly quixotic quest that simulators have to make it as realistic as possible in all ways. Ron Harden and I engaged in a thing after I was talking about the high fidelity, low fidelity things. Yes, Jeff, but you've forgotten about motivation. Was my response. And so I assume then that a student who's putting a stethoscope on a plastic chest that's layered all pink is somehow more motivated to learn heart sounds than somebody listening to their iPhone.
Or the harps or whatever.
So the point being that we've suffered far too long, and we can go back to our second curriculum in the 80s, where all the quest was to make everything totally realistic. You can never achieve that, nor should you. This really said that's exactly the wrong thing to go.
I'm glad we moved from the heart sounds on the CD onto the iPhone.
Yes.
Hey, I got control of the technology, man.
And I'm going to end there just for timing, and to say thank you to everyone that joined us on Zoom. First, we're going to be closing that down now. I guess everyone in the room can continue to engage with Dr. Ellaway and the